else is control. He must be in control of himself, his voice, his emotions. He must know what is coming next in the broadcast, and he must move smoothly and confidently from segment to segment. Again, it would be unthinkable for the anchor to break down and weep over his story, or laugh uncontrollably on camera, no matter how human these responses may be. Many other features of the newscast help the anchor to establish the impression of control. These are usually equated with professionalism in broadcasting. They include such things as graphics that tell the viewer what is being shown, or maps and charts that suddenly appear on the screen and disappear on cue, or the orderly progression from story to story, starting with the most important events first. They also include the absence of gaps or dead time during the broadcast, even the simple fact that the news starts and ends at a certain hour. These common features are thought of as purely technical matters, which a professional crew handles as a matter of course. But they are also symbols of a dominant theme of television news: the imposition of an orderly world, called the news, upon the disorderly flow of events. While the form of a news broadcast emphasizes tidiness and control, its content can best be described as chaotic. Because time is so precious on television, because the nature of the medium favors dynamic visual images, and because the pressures of a commercial structure require the news to hold its audience above all else, there is rarely any attempt to explain issues in depth or place events in their proper context. The news moves nervously from a warehouse fire to a court decision, from a guerrilla war to a World Cup match, the quality of the film often determining the length of the story. Certain stories show up only because they offer dramatic pictures. Bleachers collapse in South America. Hundreds of people are crushed. A perfect television news story, where the cameras can record the face of disaster in all its anguish. Back in Washington, a new budget is approved by Congress. Here there is nothing to photograph because a budget is not a physical event. It is a document full of language and numbers. So the producers of the news will show a photo of the document itself, focusing on the cover where it says, "Budget of the United States of America." Or sometimes they will send a camera crew to the government printing plant where copies of the budget are produced. That evening, while the contents of the budget are summarized by a voiceover, the viewer sees stacks of documents being loaded into boxes at the government printing plant. Then a few of the budget's more important provisions will be flashed on the screen in written form, but this is such a time-consuming process, using television as a printed page, that the producers keep it to a minimum. In short, the budget is not televisable, and for that reason, its time on the news must be brief. The bleacher collapse will get more minutes that evening. With priorities of this sort, it is almost impossible for the news to offer an adequate account of important events. Indeed, it is the trivial event that is often best suited for television coverage. This is such a commonplace that no one even bothers to challenge it. Walter Cronkite, a revered figure in television and anchorman of the CBS Evening News for many years, has acknowledged several times that television cannot be relied on to inform the citizens of a democratic nation. Unless they also read newspapers and magazines, television viewers are helpless to understand their world, Cronkite has said. No one at CBS has ever disagreed with his conclusion other than to say, "We do the best we can." Of course, it is a tendency of journalism in general to concentrate on the surface of events rather than underlying conditions. This is as true for the newspaper as it is for the newscast. But several features of television undermine whatever efforts journalists may make to give sense to the world. One is that a television broadcast is a series of events that occur in sequence, and the sequence is the same for all viewers. This is not true for a newspaper page, which displays many items simultaneously, allowing readers to choose the order in which they read them. If a newspaper reader wants only a summary of the latest tax bill, he can read the headline and the first paragraph of an article, and if he wants more, he can keep reading. In a sense, then, everyone reads a different newspaper, for no two readers will read or ignore the same items. But all television viewers see the same broadcast. They have no choices. A report is either in the broadcast or out, which means that anything which is of narrow interest is unlikely to be included.
Top of 44.
As NBC News executive Reuben Frank once explained, a newspaper, for example, can easily afford to print an item of conceivable interest to only a fraction of its readers. A television news program must be put together with the assumption that each item will be of some interest to everyone that watches. Every time a newspaper includes a feature which will attract a specialized group, it can assume it is adding at least a little bit to its circulation. To the degree a television news program includes an item of this sort, it must assume that its audience will diminish. The need to include everyone, an identifying feature of commercial television in all its forms, prevents journalists from offering lengthy or complex explanations, or from tracing the sequence of events leading up to today's headlines. One of the ironies of political life in modern democracies is that many problems which concern the general welfare are of interest only to specialized groups. Arms control, for example, is an issue that literally concerns everyone in the world, and yet the language of arms control and the complexity of the subject are so daunting that only a minority of people can actually follow the issue from week to week and month to month. If it wants to act responsibly, a newspaper can at least make available more information about arms control than most people want. But commercial television cannot afford to do so. This illustrates an important point in the psychology of television's appeal. Many of the items in newspapers and magazines are not, in a strict sense, demanded by a majority of readers. They are there because some readers might be interested, or because the editors think their readers should be interested. On commercial television, might and should are not the relevant words. The producers attempt to make sure that each item will be of some interest to everyone that watches, as Reuben Frank put it. What this means is that a newspaper or magazine can challenge its audience in a way that television cannot. Print media have the luxury of suggesting or inviting interest, whereas television must always concern itself with conforming to existing interests. In a way, television is more strictly responsive to the demands of its huge audience. But there is one demand it cannot meet: the desire to be challenged, to be told this is worth attending to be surprised by what one thought would not be of interest. Another severe limitation on television is time. There's simply not enough of it. The evening news programs at CBS, NBC, and ABC all run for 30 minutes, 8 of which are taken up by commercials. No one believes that 22 minutes for the day's news is adequate. For years, news executives at ABC, NBC, and CBS have suggested that the news be expanded to 1 hour. But by tradition, the half hour after the national evening news is given over to the hundreds of local affiliate stations around the country to use as they see fit. They have found it a very profitable time to broadcast game shows or half-hour situation comedies, and they are reluctant to give up the income they derive from these programs. The evening news produced by the 3 networks is profitable for both the networks and the local stations. The local stations are paid a fee by the network to broadcast the network news, and they profit from this fee since the news produced by the network costs them nothing. It is likely that they would also make money from a 1-hour newscast, but not as much, they judge, as they do from the game shows and comedies they now schedule. The result is that the evening news must try to do what cannot reasonably be done: give a decent account of the day's events in 22 minutes. What the viewer gets instead is a series of impressions, many of them purely visual, most of them unconnected to each other or to any sense of a history unfolding. Taken together, They suggest a world that is fundamentally ungovernable, where events do not arise out of historical conditions, but rather explode from the heavens in a series of disasters that suggest a permanent state of crisis. It is this crisis, highly visual, ahistorical, and unsolvable, which the evening news presents as theater every evening. The audience for this theater is offered a contradictory pair of responses. On the one hand, it is reassured by the smooth presentation of the news itself, especially the firm voice and steady gaze of the trusty anchorman. Newscasts frequently end with a human interest story, often with a sentimental or comic touch.
For
example, a little girl in Chicago writes Gorbachev a letter, and he answers her, saying that he and President Reagan are trying to work out their differences. This item reassures viewers that all is well. Leaders are in command. We can still communicate with each other, and so on. But, and now we come to the other hand, the rest of the broadcast has told a different story. It has shown the audience a world that is out of control and incomprehensible, full of violence, disaster, and suffering. Whatever authority the anchorman may project through his steady manner is undermined by the terror inspired by the news itself. This is where television news is at its most radical, not in giving publicity to radical causes, but in producing the impression of an ungovernable world. And it produces this impression not because the people who work in television are leftists or anarchists. The anarchy in television news is a direct result of the commercial structure of broadcasting, which introduces into news judgments of single-mindedness more powerful than any ideology, the overwhelming need to keep people watching.
Okay, so we now turn to this essay and analyze this essay, and of course, as we've already said, there is a huge distance from the time this essay was published, roughly the mid-1980s, around roughly 1985, to today, when we look at this essay as really, in many ways, an artifact. So let's write that down right away. This is an artifact essay. It's like looking back in time where when the writer was writing, he had a set of concerns that today, when we look back, we literally laugh at those concerns and say, really? So in other words, for example, he will say, there's only 3 TV networks and they get 22 minutes every day to deliver the news. Today we have what's called, for your notes, the 24-hour news cycle. In other words, all 3 of those news stations that he was talking about, ABC, NBC, CBS, now have online news cycle that goes all the time. So for example, you can wake up at 2:30 in the morning and you can go to your handheld device, or of course the TV is still available with cable or whatever, and you can find multiple news sources that are telling you what's going on all over the world. The minute anything happens, right, immediately it will find itself onto some kind of a news show or whatever. And of course, today, we're not so clear always whether we're watching the news or whether we're watching some kind of a conversational show or something like that. But Postman was onto something, and we want to pay attention to his concerns. Let's go back now to the beginning of the essay, and let's make sure we at least know what his original thesis is. First of all, right away on page 478, the last paragraph, he tells us what his concerns are. The language of pictures differs radically from oral and written language, and the differences are crucial for understanding television news. So let's put it in our notes. One of the things that Postman was concerned about was the difference between what we will call print media, newspapers, okay, and this thing called TV news, all right? There was a debate at the time. The New York Times was the classic example of the newspaper of America, all the news that's fit to print. And you had this newspaper. It could run in, are you ready for this? On a Sunday edition of the New York Times, it can run into the hundreds of pages with little tiny print that runs in columns. That was the way the majority of people got their news for a very long time. Then along comes radio. Then all of a sudden in the late 50s and 60s, news starts to become something television will produce. Postman was concerned about this, and he says, I'll tell you why. TV's driven by what you look at. And that means pictures, and people like pictures. So in other words, news stories are going to be dominated by our need to somehow look at stuff. If we can look at stuff, we can be, and here it comes, entertained. The other concern that Postman has is what drives TV news is, of course, economics. It's all about money. There's a lot of money involved. Of course, Postman in 1985 couldn't have imagined that a 30-second commercial during the Super Bowl would cost millions and millions of dollars, as it does now. Back in the day, there was no idea that TV would be able to generate that kind of money. Well, of course, today, we live in a whole different world, where we have thousands and thousands of news sources, most of them available online, and you can pick up your device, and you can, of course, begin very quickly to work with search engines. Of course, one of the most popular, Google, will immediately tell you information about what's going on in the world, but we have to ask an obvious question. Every second, there are thousands and thousands of things happening on this planet that we would call news. Question: how come some of that stuff gets reported and some of that stuff does not? Most of it gets reported. It's just a question of how it comes to you. In other words, when you look at those lists of those few headlines that are on that screen of your smartphone and you swipe it away really quickly, if you ever do look at the list of those headlines, this is a fascinating question. Who decides what's important to be listed there? Right? Like, who gets to decide that stuff that you flip off? Because trust me, as you get older, you're not going to flip that stuff off. I guarantee you that once you have children, you'll be more interested in that list of what's going on. Now, sometimes we don't have a choice. And this is why so many adults in your life talk about, for example, the date that we officially call in American history 9/11. Because when that happened, and that famous attack happened at 9/11, everybody all of a sudden wanted to know what was going on. And they either went to the TV or they went to their handheld device to try to figure out what was going on. The only difference is we didn't have very much of the handheld device stuff still in that time. It was still kind of coming along. Today, of course, we have all of that stuff. Let's take a look very quickly at how Postman now will resurrect and present his expository essay. And again, there's some debate about whether this is an essay of exposition or if it's really a kind of clandestine, like, persuasive essay, or really what Postman is saying is, you know, we should probably spend more time reading newspapers than watching TV news, because newspapers present us with a much larger and fuller understanding of the world. But let's go ahead and look at the way he does present this argument, at least, or this position, right? Notice he says the biggest problem on 478, let's write this one down at level 1. The biggest problem is that in TV news, there's no real sense of past or future. Everything is immediate, everything is in the now, right? He makes a second point on 479, that the grammar of moving pictures favors images that change. For example, we love fire, we love things blowing up. We're like children, he says, we're regressing. We're like children. We love car wrecks. We like earthquakes and typhoons. If we're going to watch anything, it's got to have some kind of like dramatic effect to it. So for example, a news story about the budget out of Washington, D.C., which is way more consequential in your life than, you know, most other things, because the budget's going to tell you what kind of monies will be available or not available to help you do any number of kinds of things. All of that kind of stuff gets kind of lost because, I mean, it's not very dramatic, it's not very exciting, it's not very interesting, we might say, right? In other words, on 479 at the very end, he begins to, and Postman was genius about this, he pointed out, increasingly, Americans become more spectators who need to be entertained than just informed. I would write that one down. It's a huge concern. We become spectators who need to be entertained than informed. In other words, it all becomes about money, right? And on page 480, we start to think about the ways that things have changed. He says it. The news has to become more dramatic now. And he uses a famous movie star named Clint Eastwood, who maybe you know of today. Eastwood has maybe made a movie or two that you are familiar with. But in the day, Eastwood was a really famous actor who could look into the camera and he could make a statement, and it was very dramatic and all of that kind of stuff, right? Okay. Think about the last Jackie Chan film you watched. And think about the bad guy in that film. And think about it, the moment when the bad guy is at his worst. Notice what the camera does. It comes right in on his face, right? And it shows the close-up of the face. And there's usually some music going on, all right? And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, we're about to get a serious fight here. This is awesome. That's called dramatic effect. Observation. Increasingly, Postman said, that's what's going to happen on news. And here's why. People won't watch if it's boring. Well, the only way it's not going to be boring is if the person presenting the news is kind of like crazy animated, dramatic, and the stuff that's being talked about's got to be crazy animated, dramatic, or nobody's going to pay any attention to it. Well, yeah, but some of the most important stuff that happens in politics is not really dramatic. It's called making decisions, for example, about silly things like a budget until it ain't silly because it has to do with the way we live our lives. Well, nobody's going to care about stuff like that. This is Postman's kind of prophetic voice in play. Notice he says everything's got to be extreme and dramatic. And then we come to an important thesis on 480. Take a look at it. Last paragraph. With these principles in mind, look what he says. Read it with me on 480. I'm doing a close reading with you now. With these principles in mind, let us, he's talking to you, the reader, let us examine more closely the structure of a typical newscast. And then he goes into it. Now, what I found interesting about reading this, because I know you as freshmen are like, dude, this is a boring essay. Wait a minute. Let's try it at level 3. Let's try at level 3 to somehow relate to this. Watch this, watch this. He's going to talk about how a news broadcast opens in the mid-1980s. By the way, much of this still applies to dated news, but I'm going to step out of the news for a second and watch this. When you fire up your video game, think about this, because all of you game. On some level or another, most of you game, right? When you fire up your video game,